A very good morning. I'm Nabil Ahmed, Regional Partner, heading TBS Singapore and TBS Dubai. So welcome on board for our webinar on understanding incorporating a company in Singapore by an Indian. So to understand the scheme of presentation today, we're going to be discussing a little bit about Singapore as a destination, why Singapore is interesting, understanding the registration procedure for forming the company, the duration for incorporation, which is an interesting factor, and we cannot do anything with the company without a bank account, so we'll understand the procedure for opening a bank account. And to woo the foreign investor, like an Indian incorporating a company in Singapore, we would like to understand what are your tax benefits, and for that, we need a tax residency certificate. We'll look at the procedures for obtaining the same. And last but not the least, we'll touch upon a bit of RBI regulation for investment outside India and to a country like Singapore. So once again, good morning. Let's get started with our presentation. So understanding Singapore as a destination, Singapore, officially the Republic of Singapore, which is an island city-state in the Southeast Asia, which is very close to Malaysia and Indonesia. Singapore is one of the fastest growing countries in Southeast Asia. But if you look at the population, it's only a 5.5 million people in a small country of 682 square kilometers. But the GDP is close to about $300 billion, which is something which excites everybody to understand why Singapore has such a great GDP, what happens inside Singapore. Singapore being a dynamic city, it forms part of the global financial center with various banks and financial institutions operating there. It's a regional trade hub, which helps to trade between Far East Asian countries. And it's a logistic hub for the ports, are one of the biggest ports in the world. In terms of per capita income, Singapore is the 7th largest per capita with just 5.5 million people and the 39th biggest economy in the world listing. So it is quite fascinating to look at a country so small, but having so many important numbers. And one more easy information for operating in Singapore is their language. English is a diverse language, and they have extremely strong business and legal framework. In terms of the GDP of Singapore, there's a growth rate of 2% year on year, and inflation is lowest at 0.2% every year. The unemployment is only 2%, and the World Bank has categorized Singapore for 10 consecutive years as one of the best places and the easiest places to do business. So why is it interesting? Many foreigners who would want to invest in a foreign land would want to hold 100% of their shares or ownership. In many countries, it's not possible, where you need to have a local shareholder. But in Singapore, a foreigner can invest and hold 100% of the shares without a need of a local shareholder. This gives the local shareholder or the foreign shareholder a good amount of satisfaction, as well as a good amount of security that he holds his entire shares. And this enables flexibility in dynamic operations. And it also gives him a security for future investments because he's a 100% shareholder. There is no restriction from Singapore for foreign funds flowing into Singapore or outside Singapore. So repatriation becomes very, very easy. And for any of us who wants to do business outside our country or outside our comfort zone, we would want to do a business in a country where there is world-class infrastructure. So Singapore provides world-class infrastructure. They focus extremely on technology. And if any foreigner would like to form a company in Singapore, being a foreign national, but focuses on technology or innovation, government has an N number of grants for qualifying activities. So government provides grants to companies after enhancing and understanding what kind of activity they're going to do. And if it focuses on innovation and technology, educational, healthcare sector, government are free to come forward and give grants, even for a foreign company. To continue the long list, you want to also set up a company in a country where the government is stable. So Singapore has got an extremely stable government and a legal structure. And the bureaucrats are extremely professional and extremely skilled. You'll be amazed to see the speed at which things get done in various government departments in Singapore. Of course, all this cannot the procedure is straightforward and simple, and we'll understand more as we go on. And for any foreigner who would want to, again, out of his comfort zone and invest in a company outside India or move his funds outside India, he would like to have some advantages over his foreign soil. So corporate tax is at lowest in Singapore at 17%. There is no double taxation. There's no tax on capital gains and no tax on dividends from Singapore. So going forward and understanding about the overseas direct investments, this is going to give you a clear insights on how India has been looking at Singapore for overseas direct investment. In the last year, overseas direct investment out of India, Singapore has taken the lion's shares of close to 924 billion rupees. And you can see the pie chart there, where 1/4 of the total investments which has gone outside India has been in Singapore. So Singapore is a place where many large Indian groups set up their companies to manage day-to-day operations. They have an office location, they have their factory locations, they hire manpower, and it generally becomes their headquarters in Singapore over the years. A recent example of Reckitt Benckiser, which is one of the largest fast-moving consumer goods company who had their headquarters in Amsterdam, has moved their company's headquarters to Singapore recently. If you look into the left side, you will see a graph. It's a graph which shows the ease of doing business score. And you can see over 2013 to 2016, the numbers have come down, but after 2017, the numbers have gone up. But if you focus on the numbers, the score has always been about 80 over 100. This is a fascinating information because 2013 to 15, probably the numbers came down because it was a hit by recession and everybody had to feel the pinch of it. But overall, doing business in Singapore and the ease of doing business Singapore score has always been about 80 over the last decade. And the World Bank has recently certified Singapore for 10 consecutive years that this is one of the most easiest place to do business in the world. Coming now to the most important and interesting aspect of today's presentation on the registration procedures and to form the company in Singapore. So I've briefly categorized forming companies in Singapore into 5 activities. So you start with the name approval, you understand the structure of the company you want to form, then you appoint some key professionals and key personals, then you will have to have a registered office address, and then you form your constitution, and then you go on for the online activity. So I'm going to take you through each and every step to understand how we go ahead forming company in Singapore. So we'll start with the first process, which is the name approval process. The name approval process is very much likely to any other countries in the world where you go and select a name. But the only advantage in Singapore is it's online and it's done extremely quick. Only thing we have to take care is the name should not be identical to any existing businesses because it can land in trouble. So there is a government department called ACRA, which is Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority. So they are the department which takes care of approving companies for incorporation. So a name application has to be made in ACRA. So once you're making a name application, within 15 minutes, you're going to understand whether the name is available or not. So what ACRA takes into account, ACRA sees that the name is not identical to any of the business. It also gives you recommendation. If there's a name identical that you've chosen, it says you could use a different name as A, B, C, D, and you can choose one of it. And the name should not be reserved by any other company, and the name must not be undesirable, should not hurt anybody's sentiments. So ACRA takes due care of that before giving a name approval. So once the name is approved, you have the name for 120 days, 6 months, and it can be reserved for a fee of $15, which can also be paid online. And once you have the name approval, you go in for the next step. So the next step is determining the company structure. As we all know, there are 2 broad categories of structures of companies, one being a public company, other one being a private company. Public company, of course, there can be limited by shares or limited by guarantee. You can have more than 50 shareholders, you raise capital from public, you have your prospectus before all these procedures, your directors have to qualify. So there is a step of events which has to be completed before you incorporate a public company. Coming to a private company, if an Indian national would like to do business in Singapore, either extend his existing business or form a new business, he can fall into one of the 2 categories. It can be either an exempt private company where he's looking at a small scale business where his turnover is not going to exceed more than 5 million Singapore dollars a year. He enjoys lesser government regulation. You don't need to file your accounts with ACRA on a yearly basis. You cannot have more than 20 shareholders. And the most important criteria is you cannot have a corporate shareholder, which means, let's say you have a company in India and your Indian company would like to have a subsidiary in Singapore. In this case, you cannot be an exempt private company. So there you go to the next category where you have a company limited by shares. Under a company limited by shares, you can have a maximum of 50 shareholders, and you are allowed to have a corporate shareholder whereby your parent company outside the country can hold shares partially or wholly in your company in Singapore. But of course, there are some government regulations which needs to be taken into account. You'll have to file your annual accounts with ACRA, which is Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority. You conduct your AGMs and you file your paperwork on time, and you will have to follow the government regulations for a limited company by shares. And if you fall into the ambit of audit, then audit becomes mandatory, and you will have to file your auditing report within 6 months from the completion of your financial year. So we have seen the name approval, we have seen determining the company structure. Now we go into the third point where you appoint the key person. So here I would like you to have a close attention, because this is the place where it's important to understand how do you appoint and whom do you appoint. So let us say I'm a Singaporean, I would like to form a company. So if I'm a resident Singaporean, I can easily form a company where I can be the director of the company, and I will have to engage one person as a company secretary, and I will have to hold the shares, and it's a very easy formation. But if you're a foreign national and you would like to have a company incorporated in Singapore, from Singapore government's point of view, they would like to have some accountability from a local citizen or a permanent resident in Singapore. So one of the important and a primary factor for forming company in Singapore's requirement is, if a foreign national would like to form a company in Singapore, you will have to engage a local resident director. Now, a local resident director can be a Singaporean citizen, or he can be a holder of a permanent residentship. So this can happen in two ways. You know somebody in Singapore, you engage him as a partner to your organization, and you start the company together, then he becomes a local resident director. Or option two is, there are many service providers for providing local service resident director in Singapore for an annual fee. So for an Indian, he engages a service of a resident Singaporean, and the resident Singaporean becomes one of the directors of the company. So your directorship part is taken care of. The second step is to ensure that your compliances are taken care. So ACRA requires a company to have to appoint a company secretary within 6 months from the date of your company's incorporation. So after your company is incorporated, within 6 months, you engage a company secretarial firm or a company secretary in his individual capacity to take care of your filing of your required documentation and compliances on an annual basis. Coming to the third point on auditors, as I've discussed earlier, only if you fall into the ambit of audit where your number of employees are about 50, or your turnover is about 10 million, or your asset base is about $10 million, then you fall into the ambit of audit where it's mandatory for you to engage an auditor and file your audited financial statements. In other cases, you're not required, or it's not compulsory for you to engage an auditor. So foreigners who wish to incorporate a local Singapore company will have to engage the service of a registered filing agent, who's your company secretary, and employ a director to meet the desired requirement, that is your local director in Singapore, who's a Singapore national or a permanent resident in Singapore. So we have done the name selection, then we have done the understanding the nature of the company, then we have gone through the procedure of hiring a local director and a company secretary. The next step will be on understanding your share capital. So share capital in Singapore must be a minimum amount of $1, so you can form a $1 share company, and the amount of issued share capital should be indicated. The company should have at least one shareholder. So if you're an exempt private company, the shareholder must be an individual. If you want to be a company limited by shares, where you would want to have a corporate shareholding, your shareholder can be either a corporate or an individual. So companies can issue either ordinary or preference shares for the formation of the company with a minimum share capital of $1. So now name approval is looked at. We have seen the structure of the company. We have appointed our professionals and personals. Now coming to the registered office. See, this is very, very important, because most of the communication in Singapore has to be done through a registered office. So one of the primary requirements for formation of company is to have a registered company address. So registered company address can be available in two forms, where a registered company secretary provides a service of giving a company's address for a fee, or if the company wishes to operate and manage its office in Singapore, they can rent a premises in Singapore where they would want to engage and do their businesses. But it's important that in the registered office, the company's registers and records have to be kept for a minimum period of 5 years. So all your accounting reports, your corporate and regulatory documentation will have to be maintained for 5 years in your registered office. It should be operational and accessible to the public during office hours, and it should have a registered office in Singapore. So all your communications from the government departments comes to your registered Singapore address of your office in Singapore. So the last step before we go in for formation of the company is formation of your constitution. So just to understand what is a constitution is a document that generally specifies all your rules governing your relationship between the activities of the company, its shareholders, and any other stakeholders of the company. In other keywords, we call it as a memorandum of association, an article of association of a company. So it's a legal document which has to be submitted upon incorporation of a company. So you need to keep these documentations ready before you go into the final step where you lodge these documents online. So this constitution describes the key characteristics of a company, what are your activities, and what are your do's and don'ts. It contains the rules and regulations for corporate governance, its responsibilities, the powers it's given to its personals. It describes how operations will be carried out, states the rights and responsibilities. So it is more like a dictionary for the company to understand what are the do's and don'ts and what are their rights and responsibilities and what are its activities and its relationship to the companies and shareholders. And it's a very important document because it's formed at the time of formation of the company. But if a company feels that it needs to do some changes to this constitution, at a future date, it can always go for amendment of the constitution. And after the amendment, it has to be lodged and filed with ACRA, which is the Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority. So we have looked into the 5 broad areas where you could go ahead and incorporate, be prepared for incorporation of the company. So you started with the name approval, then you have gone ahead and looked into the type and structure of your company. Then we have formed the required key personal information, like you need to have one local director and one company secretary. Then we have gone for a registered office address and we have selected the office address. And last but not the least, your constitution is ready. So once all these 5 processes are complete, then you go in for incorporation of the company. And this is the most easiest and the quickest step. It generally takes 5 to 10 minutes to incorporate a company in Singapore. So you go to the website www.bizfile.gov.sg. In that website, you have to register and log in through a SingPass. SingPass is a Singapore pass for entering into this profile. And generally, Singapore residents, Singapore permanent residents, Singapore citizens have an access to SingPass. So when a foreigner engages the services of a local resident director or a company secretaryship, they get access to log into BizFile. Once you've set up the company there, you give all your required information of the shareholder, like his personal details, his address, permanent address in India, and all the other information. Then your company information is lodged. Then all shareholders and company secretary must endorse their consent within 120 days from name approval. And within that period, your company can be formed. Once the company is formed, the company has to go and register for corporate pass for filing all their business transactions with ACRA, wherever there is a mandate to file the taxes and to lodge your company documents with ACRA. You need to have a corp pass, which is registered after the company is formed. So the duration for the formation of the company, as I mentioned earlier, since the entire process is computerized and there's no manual intervention, the entire process could be finished in few minutes. However, the preparation works can take few days, where you take up all the information of the local shareholder, the foreign shareholder, the local director, and have all the documentation prepared. The constitution is ready. This could take up to a couple of days. One more point about the constitution. Generally, there is a predefined format of the constitution. So if a company would not want to change any clauses there, they can just follow the predefined format of the constitution and move on for company formation. Now your company is formed. You got your online confirmation from ACRA that your company has been formed. Your share certificate is issued. You get an ACRA profile, which spans to a 3-page document, which tells you what is the name of the company, your prescribed activities, and who are your shareholders, who are your local directors, your company secretary, your address details. Everything is given in an ACRA profile. So once that ACRA profile is ready, you move on for the next step on opening bank account. So to open a bank account, of course, a complete and duly signed corporate bank account form has to be filled up with all the information of the directors, signatory, and ultimate beneficiary. You will have to have a certified copy of the certificate of incorporation, which you also got by the email confirmation sent by ACRA. This will be certified by the company secretary to ensure the originality of the document. You have the company BIS profile that is also certified by the company secretary. The bank gives you a board of resolution format that has to be taken up in the company's format and signed by the directors for the purpose and giving the consent of formation and opening of a bank account for the company. Certified copy of your constitution, which is the memorandum and articles of association. And for the local director, you have your passport or his local ID. So that has to be ready and signed by them. So once all these documents are submitted to the bank has to verify these documentation, and on a case-to-case basis, if they need more information, you go back and ask those information. Now, how do you form this bank account? There are some scenarios where the bank accounts are formed without the foreign individual Indian flying down to Singapore, but that's on a case-to-case basis where it's signed on a foreign branch. So let's say, for example, there's DBS Bank in Singapore, and they've got a branch in India. So the signatory can go to the branch in India and sign up for opening the bank account. Physical presence of the signatory in Singapore is majority required in most of the other cases to open the bank account in Singapore. So once the bank account is opened, the next step is why we have formed the company and what are the relief that an Indian wants to understand to see whether they can receive from Singapore. As you know, the source of income lies where the services are performed for any country. So hence a source country has a right to tax. So if you do a business in Singapore, Singapore has the right to tax that income derived from that company. At the same time, based on your resident country also has the right to tax on your global income. So in this case, you will have to provide a tax residency certificate from Singapore to the country where you belong or to the country where you are a resident to prove that your company is a resident Singaporean company. So for that purpose, we apply for a tax residency certificate. There are a few terms and conditions which you'll have to first satisfy prior to applying for the tax residency certificate. And once the tax residency certificate is issued by the assessing officer from IRAS, which is Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore, you are relieved from double taxation. And to avoid double taxation relief, which can be claimed under the double taxation avoidance agreement, which is there between countries. To claim the relief, TRC is required from the resident country's authorities. Now, I would want to take some time to explain to you how the TRC is issued. After the company is formed and after establishing the place of effective management for the company is in Singapore, the resident director is in Singapore, the foreigner is also operating the business from Singapore. So after all these points are proved, you make an application in Form 10FA to the tax authorities via a tax portal. The tax portal is again available using the corporate pass, which we discussed earlier. So once you have the corporate pass ready, you log in through the corporate pass and you will have to file an application for obtaining a TRC. So you give the relevant information about your company, what business you do, what incomes the company has earned, from which country they have been earned. Once all these information are submitted, the filing is lodged with IRAS portal. The assessing officer assesses the documents, and if further information is required, they get back using the company's registered email address and they ask for information. The primary information which we have to provide initially in Form 10A will be the purpose for which the tax residency certificate is required, the PAN card details, the addresses, name, email IDs, period for which the tax residency is applicable. And once all these details are given and the assessing officer is satisfied that the company is a resident company in Singapore, within a span of 1 to 4 weeks, the company's tax residency certificate is issued, again, an online, and a hard copy of the certificate is sent to the company's registered office. And using that, the company can take up take the benefit of the double taxation avoidance agreement. So now moving on to the overseas direct investment. How can we do the overseas direct investment? There are two routes. One is a resident individual and an Indian company. So if it's an Indian company, the automatic route is one of the mechanism where if your foreign currency investment outside India as a part of overseas direct investment is going to be less than 400% of the company's net worth as per your local company's balance sheet, it's automatic, but it cannot be greater than 1 billion US dollar. There's a second route where you go for an approval route where you give your proposal to the RBI and the Reserve Bank of India gives you an in-principle approval for the investment outside India. The second option is for an individual to invest overseas through the formation of the liberalized remittance scheme, where the LRS allows an Indian national who's an Indian resident to remit up to US dollars 250,000 as overseas direct investment into companies outside India. So these are the two mechanisms in which RBI allows companies to repatriate the funds. And where deemed necessary, RBI can ask for further information on the kinds of investment that's been made. And of course, reporting is mandatory at different intervals, which depends on the type of investment which is being made. So to overall summarize the discussions that we have had in the last half an hour, we can understand that Singapore is definitely a diverse city, and with the level of growth that you have seen in Singapore, it's extremely important to understand that not companies are not there because it's not that easy. So it's definitely easy to form companies in Singapore and do businesses there. It has few bottlenecks in the form of the cost of operation. Logistics is the only challenge there because the logistics gets a bit expensive in comparison to other countries. But looking at other advantages like the foreign trade, the strategic location of Singapore, their focus on technology, stabilized government, legal structure, and their regional hub for Southeast Asia, these advantages actually overrides these basic limitations or challenges that we are having in having a company in Singapore. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much. And I would like to give special credits to Vishwant for the presentation scheme. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can contact me by my email. And if you have any question, you can also type it down in your chat box. Thank you. There is a feedback form. I'm making it available for you to give your feedback. Thank you. And I look forward to meet you for the next presentation. And very soon we'll give you the information on what the next presentation is going to be. Thank you so much and have a nice day.